The sun over the Arizona Territory in 1874 was not a giver of life. It was a hammer, a relentless, white-hot force that beat down on the cracked earth until the very air shimmered with exhaustion. It bleached the sky to a pale, hazy blue and baked the red dust into a fine powder that coated everything, filling the lungs, gritting between the teeth, and painting a uniform layer of despair on man and beast alike. Along a trail that was little more than a scar on the face of the landscape, a stagecoach stop huddled against the base of a sun-blasted mesa. It wasn't a town, not even a settlement. It was an outpost of human stubbornness, a few buildings of warped, sun-bleached timber that looked as if they were one stiff wind away from surrendering back to the dust from which they were built. A tired stagecoach, its leather suspension groaning with every rut, had deposited its handful of passengers hours ago. They were scattered now, clinging to the slivers of shade offered by the canted porch of the saloon or the meager overhang of the livery stable. They were a portrait of depletion, a farmer and his wife, their faces etched with the lines of a failed dream, sat on a bench without speaking, their gaze fixed on the merciless horizon. A young prospector, his youthful optimism already eroded by the unforgiving land, listlessly cleaned his fingernails with a knife, his movements slow and defeated. They shared a common language of silence, a collective understanding that this place was not a destination, but a pause in a journey that was likely to end in disappointment. Hope was a currency they no longer possessed. From this collection of weary souls, a young woman detached herself. Her name was Eleanor, though no one had called her that in a long time. She was a creature of frayed edges and watchful stillness. Her calico dress, once a cheerful blue, was now a uniform of dust and sweat, the hem tattered from miles of walking. A cheap bonnet, its ribbon limp, did little to shield her face from the oppressive heat. She moved with a purpose that belied her apparent fragility, her shoulders held tight, her steps measured and deliberate as she approached the largest of the buildings, the saloon. It was a place called The Last Chance, a name that felt more like a warning than an invitation. Before she pushed open the swinging doors, she paused, her hand hovering over the wood. She took a shallow breath, the hot, dry air burning her throat. This was the most dangerous part. Out here, under the vast, indifferent sky, the dangers were elemental thirst, heat, starvation. They were honest in their lethality. But in a place like this, the dangers wore human faces, and they were far more complicated and cruel. She could feel the stares of the men on the porch, could feel their eyes tracing the lines of her worn dress, making calculations, weighing her worth and her vulnerability. She pushed the thought away, hardening her expression, pulling a mask of weary indifference over the fear that fluttered like a trapped bird in her chest. The saloon doors swung inward with a protesting squeak, and she stepped from the blinding glare into a world of shadow and stale smells. The air inside was thick and suffocating, a cocktail of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and the lingering smoke of countless hand-rolled cigarettes. Dust motes danced in the few shafts of light that pierced the gloom through grime-caked windows. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust, and, as they did, the room resolved itself into a tableau of quiet menace. It was not a large space. A long, scarred bar ran along one wall, overseen by a bartender whose face was a roadmap of bad decisions and bitter compromises. A handful of men were scattered at the rough-hewn tables. They were not cowboys in the romantic sense of the word. They were hard men, their faces burned by the sun and carved by hardship. They were prospectors whose luck had run dry, drifters with nowhere else to go, and a few whose profession was etched in the cold, predatory stillness with which they watched the world. They were men who had shed their softer parts miles back, leaving them behind on the trail like excess baggage. As Eleanor stepped fully into the room, a low murmur that had been humming beneath the silence died away. Every eye turned to her. It was an appraisal, swift and thorough. They saw the dusty dress, the slender frame, the absence of a male protector at her side. To them, she was an anomaly, an opportunity, a problem. A large man with a tangled, greasy beard and small, piggish eyes grinned, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. He nudged his companion, a wiry man with a nervous twitch in his cheek, and gestured with his chin towards her. The gesture was crude, possessive, and it sent a fresh wave of ice through Eleanor's veins. She knew that type. She had been running from men like that her entire life. Her gaze swept the room, a desperate, silent plea for a safe harbor that she knew she would not find. She catalogued the faces, looking for a flicker of decency, a hint of kindness, and found none. There was open avarice, cold indifference, and bored cruelty. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive quiet. She felt a familiar, sickening sense of being trapped, of the walls closing in. Her instinct screamed at her to turn, to flee back into the punishing sun, but she knew that would be a mistake. To show fear was to invite the wolves. She had to find a corner, a place to be small, to be invisible, until the stagecoach was ready to leave. Her eyes continued their sweep, past the leering men, past the impassive bartender, past a table where two men were playing cards with a grim intensity. And then, in the darkest corner of the room, her gaze landed on him. He was different. He sat alone, his back to the wall, a position that spoke of habit and caution. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with a lean strength that was apparent even in his stillness. A battered hat rested on the table next to a half-empty glass of water. His shirt, a faded blue chambray, was worn thin at the elbows and across the shoulders, testament to long days of hard work under the sun. A simple leather gun belt was slung low on his hips, the handle of the pistol worn smooth from a familiar hand. He wasn't drinking whiskey like the others. He just sat there, a silent observer, a part of the room but somehow entirely separate from it. But it was his face that held her. It was a strong face, with a square jaw shadowed by a day's worth of stubble. It was not a handsome face in the conventional sense. It was too weathered, too stark. There were lines around his eyes and mouth that spoke of things seen and endured. Yet, there was a profound calm about him, a stillness that seemed to emanate from his very core. He wasn't watching her with the predatory hunger of the others. He was simply looking, his expression unreadable. And his eyes, they were the color of slate, of a sky before a storm, a deep, steady gray that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. They were eyes that had seen the curve of the earth from a high mesa, that had watched the stars wheel across an endless night sky, that had looked into the face of violence and had not flinched. They were the eyes of a man who was comfortable with silence, who knew his own mind, and who was not easily moved. As her desperate, frightened gaze met his calm, steady one, something shifted in the fabric of the universe. The oppressive weight of the other men's stares seemed to lessen. The thick, suffocating air of the saloon seemed to thin, just enough for her to draw a real breath. The low hum of flies and the distant clank from the smithy faded into a muted background hum. For a single, stretched-out moment, there was nothing in the world but the space between them, a dusty, sunlit chasm bridged by a shared look. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He didn't offer any overt sign of welcome or support. But in the depths of those stone-gray eyes, Eleanor saw something she hadn't seen in so long she had forgotten it existed. She saw a quiet strength that was not a threat. It was not the aggressive power of the other men in the room. It was the anchored, immovable power of an old mountain. It was a stillness that felt, impossibly, like a sanctuary. He saw her, not as a piece of property or an opportunity, but as a person. He saw the terror she was trying so desperately to hide, and he did not look away. Time, which had been crawling forward with agonizing slowness, seemed to hang suspended on that single, silent exchange. The man in the corner held her gaze, and in that moment, Eleanor felt a flicker of something she had thought long dead. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was something smaller, more fragile, but infinitely more precious. It was the recognition that in this room full of monsters, there was at least one man who was not one of them, and in the brutal, unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory. Sometimes that was all it took to change everything. The moment stretched, thin and fragile as a strand of spider silk, yet strong enough to hold the weight of the entire room. Eleanor stood frozen just inside the doorway, the silent gray eyes of the man in the corner, her only anchor in a sea of hostile faces. The air was a physical pressure against her skin, thick with unspoken threats. The man with the greasy beard, Jedediah, watched her with an unnerving combination of amusement and ownership, as if she were a stray calf that had wandered into his pen. He was a predator savoring the fear of his prey, and he was in no hurry. For Eleanor, every second was a lifetime. Her mind, honed by years of survival, raced through 1,000 frantic calculations. To her right was the bar, a long, solid obstacle with no exit. To her left were tables of men whose expressions offered no hope of sanctuary. Behind her was the door, leading back out into the merciless, open glare of the sun where there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Ahead of her, across a small expanse of dusty floorboards, was the corner table, the still man, and the only unknown variable in this terrifying equation. He was a danger. All men were. But he was a different kind of danger. The others were a pack of coyotes, yapping and snarling. This man was a wolf, quiet and solitary, whose intentions were impossible to read. But in his stillness, there was no overt aggression, and in his eyes, she had seen a flicker of something that was not contempt. It was a desperate gamble, the kind a person makes when all other options have been stripped away. She took a step. The sound of her worn boot on the wood was unnaturally loud in the silence. Every head turned to follow her movement. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, on the patterns of dust and spilled liquor that stained the planks. She could feel Jedediah's eyes on her back, a hot, unpleasant weight. He was toying with her, letting her walk the length of the room, enjoying the show. She forced herself to breathe, a shallow, ragged intake of air that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart. One step, then another. Her legs felt like lead, her body a clumsy puppet controlled by the sheer force of her will. She was halfway to the corner when a chair scraped loudly against the floor behind her. Eleanor flinched, a small, involuntary jerk of her shoulders. She didn't have to look to know it was Jedediah. The sound was a declaration, a signal that the game was over. She risked a fleeting glance over her shoulder. He was rising to his feet, a slow, deliberate movement that oozed confidence. His bulk seemed to fill the room, casting a shadow that felt like it could swallow her whole. His grin had widened, a yellow slash in his tangled beard. He was coming for her. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her fragile composure. Time was gone. The gamble had to be made now. She turned her head forward again, her eyes locking onto the man in the corner. He hadn't moved. He watched Jedediah rise, his expression unchanged. Then his gaze returned to her. He saw the new, sharp terror in her eyes. He saw her decision crystallize. She closed the remaining distance to his table in 3 quick, desperate strides, her hands clutching the small, worn reticule she carried until her knuckles were bone white. She stopped beside his chair, so close she could smell the faint, clean scent of lye soap on his worn shirt, mingled with the honest smells of dust, leather, and sun. She stood over him, a trembling supplicant, and the words came out in a voice she barely recognized as her own, a raw, breathy whisper. "Could you pretend I'm with you?" The question hung in the air between them, small and fragile against the heavy, menacing silence of the saloon. It was a plea for a lie, an appeal for a temporary shield in a world that offered none. She didn't look at his face as she spoke. She couldn't. Her gaze was fixed on his hands, which rested on the table. They were large, capable hands, the knuckles scarred, the fingers long and blunt. They were the hands of a man who worked, who built and repaired and controlled. They were not the soft, grasping hands of the men she was used to. For a heartbeat, he did nothing. The entire saloon seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for his response. Jedediah had paused mid-stride, a look of incredulous anger dawning on his face. From the corner of her eye, Eleanor could see him. He was like a bull gathering itself to charge. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the man's refusal, for the rough laughter, for the feel of Jedediah's hand closing on her arm. Then, a sound, a soft, deliberate scrape of wood on wood. She opened her eyes. The man, Silas. His name was Silas, though she didn't know it yet, had not spoken. Instead, he had hooked the empty chair beside him with the toe of his boot and slid it out from under the table. The movement was fluid, economical, and utterly devoid of hesitation. It was an answer, clearer than any word. It was an invitation. But he wasn't finished. He slowly lifted his right hand from the table. Eleanor watched, mesmerized. As it moved through the dusty air toward her, she expected him to grab her, to be rough, but his movements were measured and calm. He gently took her left hand, the one that was clenched into a white-knuckled fist. His touch was not what she expected. His skin was calloused and rough. Yes, but the grip was surprisingly gentle, a firm warmth that enveloped her cold, trembling fingers. He didn't pull her or force her. He simply held her hand for a moment, letting her feel the solid, steady strength in his grasp. Then, with the same unhurried grace, he guided her hand, palm down, and placed it flat against his chest, over the solid wall of muscle and bone just above his heart. The shock of it coursed through her, through the thin, worn fabric of his chambray shirt. She felt the profound warmth of his body, a living, breathing heat that stood in stark contrast to the cold fear that had encased her for so long. And beneath her palm, she felt it, the slow, steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. Thump, 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 thump. It was the calmest, most reassuring sound she had ever heard. It was the rhythm of life, of strength, of a stillness that seemed unshakable. It was an anchor in her swirling vortex of panic. Her own frantic heartbeat seemed to falter, trying to match its cadence. Only then did he speak. His eyes, those steady gray stones, met hers, and he said one word. "All right." His voice was a low rumble, a deep baritone that seemed to come from the very earth itself. It was not loud, but it resonated through the room, cutting through the tension with an air of absolute finality. It was not a question. It was not an offer. It was a statement, a fact. He had made a decision, and this was the result. The strength seemed to go out of Eleanor's legs, the solid beat of his heart under her hand, the unwavering certainty in his voice, and the simple, undeniable protection of his presence broke through the dam of her terror. A wave of dizzying relief washed over her, so potent it was almost painful. Without conscious thought, she sank into the offered chair and leaned into him, her body slumping against his side as if the strings holding her upright had finally been cut. She rested her head on his broad shoulder, the rough fabric of his shirt scratching softly against her cheek. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a flicker of something that resembled safety. Silas did not wrap his arm around her. He did not pat her shoulder or offer empty words of comfort. He simply sat there, a solid, immovable presence beside her. He shifted his weight slightly, a subtle adjustment to better support her, and let his left arm rest along the back of her chair, not touching her, but creating a clear, definitive barrier between her and the rest of the room. It was a silent, powerful gesture of possession and protection. The play was so simple, yet so profoundly convincing that it silenced the entire room. Jedediah stood frozen a few feet away, his mouth hanging slightly open. The possessive grin was gone, replaced by a look of baffled rage. This was not how the script was supposed to go. The lone, frightened girl was supposed to be easy prey. She was not supposed to have a protector, especially one who radiated such an aura of quiet, dangerous capability. He looked from Eleanor, now seemingly small and fragile, curled against the stranger's side, to the man himself. He looked at the calm, steady eyes that were now fixed on him, and in their gray depths, he saw no fear, no challenge, only a flat, unyielding certainty. It was like looking at a rock wall. You could break your fists on it, but the wall would not move. The bartender stopped wiping the counter. The card players lowered their hands. The illusion they had created was perfect. They looked not like a stranger and a desperate girl, but like a man and his woman, weary from the road, sharing a quiet moment, the intimacy of her hand on his chest, the casual way she leaned against him, spoke of a long and established familiarity. Jedediah hesitated. He took in the breadth of Silas's shoulders, the calm confidence in his posture, and the worn handle of the pistol resting on his hip. A long, tense moment passed. The desire to assert his dominance warred with a sudden, unfamiliar prickle of caution. He finally let out a frustrated huff, his face darkening with resentment. He spat a wad of tobacco juice onto the floor. A final, impotent gesture of defiance. Then, with a low curse muttered under his breath, he turned and stomped back to his table, shoving his chair back into place with a loud, angry scrape. He sat down heavily, his small eyes still fixed on them, burning with a thwarted, ugly light. The immediate danger had passed, but the threat remained, simmering just beneath the surface of the now altered silence of the room. The silence that followed Jedediah's retreat was thick and unnatural, a heavy blanket that smothered all other sound. Eleanor remained pressed against Silas's side, her hand still flat against his chest, the slow, steady beat of his heart, a strange counterpoint to the frantic chaos in her own mind. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too deeply, for fear of shattering the fragile illusion of safety he had created. She could feel the heat of Jedediah's glare from across the room, a palpable force of malice. He had been denied, and a man like that did not take denial well. The immediate confrontation had been won not by a threat, but by an unyielding display of quiet certainty, and that was an insult that would fester. Silas remained perfectly still, a bastion of calm in the churning currents of the saloon. But Eleanor, pressed so closely to him, could feel a subtle shift in his body, a hardening of the muscles in his back and shoulders. He was not relaxed. He was coiled, a spring wound tight, listening not just with his ears but with his entire being. His gaze was no longer on Jedediah, but was now directed towards the grimy window, watching the play of light and shadow in the dusty street outside. He was reading the room, the town, the very air, looking for the next move on a chessboard she couldn't see. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The other patrons in the saloon, after the initial shock, tried to resume their previous activities, but their movements were stiff and self-conscious. The card players picked up their hands but didn't play. The bartender wiped the same spot on the bar over and over. They were all acutely aware of the drama that had not yet reached its conclusion. Jedediah sat hunched over his table, his thick fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey. He muttered something to his wiry companion, a man named Clem, whose eyes darted around the room like trapped insects. Jedediah's voice was too low to hear, but his meaning was clear in the angry jut of his jaw. Clem nodded nervously, his eyes flicking toward Silas and Eleanor before he pushed his chair back and scurried out the front door, trying to look casual and failing spectacularly. Silas saw it all. Eleanor felt the slight, almost imperceptible tensing of his jaw. He knew what that meant. Clem wasn't going for a breath of fresh air. He was going to fetch the rest of their pack. Jedediah wasn't going to try to take Silas on his own, not when a direct challenge had already failed. He was going to stack the deck, to return with overwhelming force. The fragile peace was about to shatter. Without turning his head, Silas spoke to her, his voice a low vibration that traveled directly from his chest into her ear. "When I move, you move with me. No questions, no hesitation. Understand?" Eleanor could only manage a small, jerky nod against his shoulder. Her throat was too tight for words. The warmth of his body, which had been a comfort just moments before, now felt like the calm at the eye of a hurricane. Silas slowly, deliberately, took his glass of water and drained it in one long swallow. He placed the empty glass on the table with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. He didn't look at Jedediah. He didn't look at anyone. His movements were smooth, masking the urgency that lay beneath. His left hand, which had been resting on the back of her chair, came down and closed gently but firmly around her upper arm. His touch was not painful, but it was absolute, leaving no room for argument. "Now," he breathed. In one fluid motion, he was on his feet, pulling her up with him. He didn't move towards the front door, towards the street where Clem had gone. He turned and pulled her towards the back of the saloon, towards a dark, curtained-off doorway she hadn't noticed before. The suddenness of the movement stole her breath. One moment they were a still life of quiet defiance. The next, they were a blur of motion. A roar of anger erupted from Jedediah's table. "Hey, where do you think you're going with her?" A chair crashed to the floor as he lunged to his feet. But Silas had anticipated it. They were already at the curtain. He ripped it aside, revealing a narrow, dark hallway that smelled of stale beer and sawdust. He pushed her ahead of him into the gloom. "Keep moving." They half ran, half stumbled down the short corridor. A door at the end was barred by a heavy wooden beam. Silas didn't slow down. He hit the beam with the heel of his hand, and it lifted from its brackets with a loud thud. He shoved the door open, and they burst out of the dark hallway into the blinding, dusty glare of a back alley. The alley was a narrow space littered with broken barrels, empty bottles, and heaps of trash. The stench was overwhelming. But there, tethered to a leaning hitching post, stood a single horse. It was a magnificent animal, a tall bay with intelligent eyes and powerful haunches, its coat gleaming with sweat even in the shade. It was saddled and ready, a bedroll and canteen tied securely behind the cantle. The horse whickered softly as Silas approached, nudging his shoulder with its nose. It had been left there for a reason. This was not a chance encounter. This man planned his exits. There was no time for finesse. Heavy, running footsteps echoed from inside the saloon. "They're out back," Jedediah bellowed. Silas moved with a desperate, focused economy of motion. He untied the reins with a single, sharp tug. He turned to Eleanor, his gray eyes intense. "Can you ride?" She shook her head, her eyes wide with panic. Not well, not like this." "Doesn't matter." He put his hands on her waist, and before she could protest, he lifted her as if she weighed nothing. The strength in his arms was staggering. He half threw, half placed her sideways onto the saddle, then swung up behind her with an athletic grace that belied his size. He landed in the seat behind her, his body a solid wall at her back, his arms coming around her to grip the reins. She was trapped, wedged between his hard chest and the saddle horn, her legs dangling awkwardly off one side. The back door of the saloon burst open, and Jedediah filled the doorway, a pistol in his hand. Two more men, drawn by Clem's call, appeared behind him. "You're not taking what's mine," he roared, raising the gun. Silas didn't hesitate. He dug his heels into the bay's flanks, and the horse exploded into motion. It leaped forward, not down the narrow alley, but turning sharply and crashing through a section of rickety fence that separated the alley from the open scrubland behind the outpost. Wood splintered. Eleanor cried out, a small, sharp sound of shock, and instinctively grabbed a handful of Silas's shirt, burying her face against his chest. They were free of the alley, out in the open, the powerful horse stretching its legs into a full, ground-devouring gallop. The jarring, violent motion was unlike anything Eleanor had ever experienced. It was not riding, it was flying, a chaotic, breathtaking rush of speed and power. The wind tore at her bonnet, ripping it from her head. Her hair, already loose, whipped wildly around her face. stinging her eyes. "Hold on tight." Silas's voice was a low growl in her ear, his breath warm against her skin. She didn't need to be told. She clung to him, her knuckles white, her body jolting with every powerful stride of the horse. She risked a glance back. Jedediah and his men were scrambling for their own horses at the front of the livery. They were losing time, but they would not give up. They were hunters, and the chase was on. Silas urged the horse on, leaning low over her, his body shielding hers from the worst of the wind. They thundered across the open land, heading not for the main trail, but for the rugged, broken country of the red sandstone mesas that rose like ancient, sleeping giants against the horizon. It was a landscape of stark, brutal beauty. The setting sun had set the western sky ablaze, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange, crimson, and violet. The red rock formations seemed to drink in the light, glowing with an internal fire. But Eleanor saw none of the beauty. She only saw a wilderness that promised no shelter, a landscape as merciless as the men pursuing them. The dust was a living thing, a choking, blinding cloud that billowed up from the horse's hooves. It coated her skin, her clothes, her hair, filling her mouth and nose with a gritty, earthy taste. It swirled around them, a hazy red curtain that partially obscured the sky, the land, and, she hoped, their trail. Her initial shock and terror began to slowly give way to the raw, physical reality of the flight. Every muscle in her body ached from the violent motion. Her lungs burned as she gasped for air. But beneath the pain and the fear, a strange new sensation was taking root. She was pressed against the solid strength of this silent man, his heartbeat a steady drum against her back. His arms were a protective cage around her, his hands firm and sure on the reins, guiding their desperate flight with an unwavering confidence. For the first time in her life, she was not running alone. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer a solitary burden. It was shared. They rode on, a single desperate entity of man, woman, and horse, fleeing across a painted desert. The sun dipped lower, stretching their shadow long and skeletal behind them. The chase was relentless, every so often. Silas would glance over his shoulder. His eyes narrowed, calculating the distance between them and their pursuers. The men were visible now, a small, dark cluster of riders silhouetted against the fiery sky, slowly gaining ground. Silas shifted his weight, guiding the bay into a narrow, winding canyon, its walls rising sheer and red on either side. The thunder of their hooves echoed off the rock, amplifying the sound, making it seem as if they were being pursued by a whole army. The air grew cooler in the shadows of the canyon. The path was treacherous, littered with loose rock and sharp turns. But Silas navigated it with an instinctual skill, his body moving in perfect unison with the horse. Eleanor was fading, her grip on his shirt slackening with exhaustion. Her world had been reduced to the most basic sensations, the jarring rhythm of the horse, the solid wall of the man behind her, the taste of dust, and the burning in her lungs. She was no longer thinking, only feeling, her body a vessel of pure, animal instinct to survive. Just as she felt she could hold on no longer, Silas slowed the horse, pulling it from a gallop to a canter, then to a jarring trot. They emerged from the canyon into a small, hidden valley as the last sliver of the sun disappeared behind the western ridge. The world was plunged into a deep, purple twilight. The sky above was a canopy of velvet, pricked with the first, faint stars. He urged the horse forward, up a steep, rocky incline, and into a thick stand of juniper and pine that clung to the side of a mesa. He finally pulled the horse to a halt in the deep shadow of an overhanging rock ledge. The animal stood trembling, its sides heaving, its breath coming in great, snorting clouds in the cooling air. For a long moment, there was no sound but the horse's ragged breathing and Eleanor's own shallow, desperate gasps. Silas didn't dismount. He sat perfectly still, listening, his head cocked, his whole body a sensory instrument scanning the darkness. Down below, in the valley they had just crossed, they heard the faint sound of horses, the distant shout of a man's voice. Their pursuers had reached the entrance to the canyon. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat, but the sounds did not grow closer. They faded, moving on, past the hidden trail that led to their hiding place. Jedediah and his men had missed their turn in the gathering darkness. Only when the last echo of their pursuers had died away did Silas finally relax his posture. A long, slow breath easing from his lungs. The immediate danger was gone. He gently disengaged her hands from his shirt, his touch surprisingly careful. He swung his leg over the back of the horse and slid to the ground. He stood for a moment, steadying himself, then turned and reached up for her. "Come on," he said softly. "You can get down now." His arms were there, strong and steady, to catch her. As her feet touched the ground, her legs, weak and trembling from the long, brutal ride, gave way completely. She crumpled, and he caught her, easily supporting her weight, holding her upright until she could stand on her own. They stood there for a moment in the deep, silent darkness. Two strangers bound by a shared flight, the night wrapping around them like a shroud as they disappeared behind a ridge of stone, swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The darkness in the high country was absolute, a thick, star-dusted velvet that swallowed the world. After the thunder of their flight, the silence that descended was profound, broken only by the chirr of crickets, the sigh of a light breeze through the juniper trees, and the soft, rhythmic puffing of the exhausted horse. Silas held Eleanor's arm for a moment longer than necessary, a steadying presence until the trembling in her legs subsided into a deep, bone-weary ache. Every muscle screamed in protest from the brutal ride, and her mind felt scoured raw, emptied of everything but the echo of fear and the overwhelming relief of stillness. He let her go and turned to the horse, his movements slow and deliberate in the faint starlight. He spoke to the animal in a low, soothing murmur, his hand stroking its sweat-slicked neck, calming it after its ordeal. Watching him, Eleanor felt a strange sense of dislocation, as if she were observing a scene from a great distance. This man, a complete stranger, had just saved her life. He had pulled her from the jaws of a trap and spirited her away into this vast, dark wilderness. And now, he was tending to his horse with a quiet, focused gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with the violent urgency of their escape. When the horse was calmer, he untied the canteen from the saddle. He walked over to her, his form a tall shadow against the slightly less black shadow of the mesa. He held it out. "Drink," he said. The word was not a request. It was a soft command, born of practicality. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely take it. He noticed, and his own hands came up to steady hers, guiding the canteen to her lips. The water was cool and clean, and it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank deeply, greedily, the liquid a balm to her dust-caked throat. He let her drink her fill before taking the canteen and leading the horse forward. Its reins looped over his arm. "This way. It's not far." She followed him, a silent, stumbling shadow. The path was little more than a goat trail, winding through a dense stand of piñon and juniper. The air was sharp with the clean, resinous scent of pine. He moved with a quiet, sure-footed confidence that spoke of an intimate knowledge of this terrain, his broad shoulders a beacon for her to follow in the oppressive dark. For Eleanor, who had spent so long navigating the treacherous landscapes of human cruelty, this physical challenge was almost a relief. There was an honesty to the sharp rocks that threatened to turn her ankle and the grasping branches that pulled at her dress. These dangers were simple, without malice. After what felt like an hour of walking, the ground began to slope downward. The dense trees thinned, and they emerged onto a wide ledge overlooking a small, hidden valley. The moon had begun to rise, a sliver of silver that bathed the scene in a soft, ethereal light. Below them, nestled in the valley floor, was a sight so unexpected it made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. It was a small cabin, built of dark, sturdy logs, with a low-pitched roof and a thin curl of smoke rising from a stone chimney. A single window glowed with a warm, yellow light, a tiny beacon of life in the immense darkness. The cabin was encircled by a rickety split-rail fence, enclosing a small patch of land where the shapes of a few sleeping animals were vaguely visible. From the valley floor rose the gentle, burbling sound of a creek, a constant, peaceful murmur. And from somewhere in the distance came the lonely, two-note call of a quail, a sound that spoke not of danger, but of a quiet, settled wilderness. The place felt ancient, secluded, a world away from the dust and violence of the stagecoach stop. It was a sanctuary, a pocket of impossible peace carved directly out of the harsh, unforgiving land. Silas led the way down a switchback trail to the valley floor. As they grew closer, the details became clearer. A small corral stood next to a lean-to stable. A well-tended garden patch lay fallow, awaiting the spring. This was not a temporary hideout. This was a home. Silas led the horse into the lean-to and began to unsaddle it with practiced efficiency. He didn't speak to Eleanor, but his silence was no longer unsettling. It felt comfortable, natural. She stood by the crooked fence gate, her arms wrapped around herself, simply watching the light in the window. A moth drawn to a flame. The warmth it promised felt like a memory from a life she had never lived. When he was done, he came to her side. "Come inside," he said quietly, his voice different here, softer, stripped of the hard edge it had carried in the saloon. He led her to the cabin's single door and pushed it open. The warmth from inside washed over her, a wave of gentle heat that seemed to seep into her chilled bones. The interior was one large room, simply and sparsely furnished, but it was immaculately clean and radiated an atmosphere of profound peace. A fire of fragrant juniper logs crackled in a large stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light across the scrubbed wooden floor. A sturdy table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A rough-hewn bookshelf filled with worn volumes was built into one wall. The air smelled of wood smoke, brewing coffee, and drying herbs that hung in bunches from the rafters. But it was not the room that held her attention. An old man with a face like a dried apple, his skin a network of deep wrinkles and his hair a shock of white, sat in a rocking chair by the fire. He was mending a piece of leather tack, his gnarled fingers surprisingly nimble. He looked up as they entered, his dark eyes sharp and intelligent. "Silas," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "You are late." "Ran into some trouble. Raoul," Silas replied, his tone respectful. He gestured toward Eleanor, who stood frozen by the door. She needed a place to stay." The old man, Raoul, looked at Eleanor. His gaze was searching, but not unkind. He took in her torn dress, her wild hair, the exhaustion etched on her face. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then his eyes went back to his mending. The matter, it seemed, was settled, as if this wasn't disorienting enough. Eleanor's eyes adjusted further to the dim light, and she saw a small cot in the warmest corner of the room, near the hearth. A small boy of about 5 or 6, with a mess of dark, curly hair, was asleep under a thick quilt, one small hand curled by his cheek. His breathing was the soft, even rhythm of innocent sleep. The sight of the child sent a fresh shock through her. A child, here, in this man's home. It was the last thing she could have ever expected. Everything she had assumed about him, that he was a drifter, a lone wolf, a man as hard and solitary as the land itself, was wrong. This was a home. He had a family, or something like it. This quiet, dangerous man who had single-handedly faced down a room of brutes was also a man who lived with an old man and a small child. The contradiction was so profound it made her head spin. Silas seemed to sense her confusion. He walked over to the fireplace and poured a cup of coffee from a pot that sat warming on the hearth. He handed it to her. Her hands were still trembling, so he wrapped her fingers around the warm tin cup. "It's all right," he said, his voice low enough so as not to wake the boy. "You're safe here." Safe. The word was so foreign. She wasn't sure she understood its meaning. He then led her to a narrow doorway at the back of the main room. He pushed the door open, revealing a small, simple room beyond. It was barely large enough to hold the furniture within a bed with a sturdy, unadorned wooden frame, a small, battered-looking wooden wardrobe, and a tiny washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher. The bed was covered with a colorful, neatly patched quilt. The air in the room was cool and smelled faintly of dried lavender and clean linen. There were no bars on the small window, only a simple calico curtain. It was the plainest room she had ever seen, yet it was also the most beautiful. It was a space that promised nothing but quiet and rest. It asked for nothing, demanded nothing. Silas stood in the doorway, not quite entering the room, his large frame seeming to fill the opening. He didn't look at her, but instead looked at the bed, as if ensuring it was suitable. "You can sleep here," he said, his voice a low murmur. He said it so simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to bring a strange, hunted woman into his home and give her a bed. He offered no explanation, asked for none in return. He didn't ask her name, where she came from, or who the men chasing her were. He didn't look at her with pity or with the veiled appraisal she was so used to seeing in men's eyes. He simply offered her a sanctuary, a place to rest, with no strings attached. Then he turned to leave, his part in the matter seemingly done. The simple, unconditional act of kindness was so alien to Eleanor's experience that it struck her with more force than a physical blow. She was a creature of transactions, of bargains and debts. She knew how to trade a moment of peace for a piece of herself, how to pay for safety with fear and submission. Kindness, in her world, was a currency used to purchase something later on. A soft bed was an advance on a debt that would be called due in the dark of night. But this was different. He was turning his back. He was walking away. He was leaving her alone, with a closed door between them, and asking for absolutely nothing. The generosity of it was terrifying. It was a language she did not speak, a code she could not decipher. She stood in the middle of the small, clean room, the warm cup of coffee growing cold in her hands, and listened to his footsteps retreat. She heard the soft murmur of his voice as he spoke to the old man, and then the quiet scrape of a chair as he sat down by the fire. She was alone. She was safe. And she was more lost and bewildered than she had ever been in her life. She sank down onto the edge of the bed, the mattress surprisingly soft beneath her. The quilt was clean and smelled of sunshine. For a long, long time, she did not move, but simply sat there in the quiet dark, listening to the gentle sounds of a sleeping child and a crackling fire, trying to understand a world where such a thing as unconditional gentleness could possibly exist. Eleanor woke to a world remade in gray and gold. The first light of dawn filtered through the calico curtain, soft and gentle, a stark contrast to the harsh, unforgiving glare she was used to. For a long moment, she lay perfectly still beneath the heavy quilt, her body a single, comprehensive ache. She listened. The cabin was not silent. A soft, rhythmic scraping sound came from the main room, the sound of a poker stirring embers back to life. A quiet cough, dry and papery, from the old man, Raoul. Then the creak of the front door and the sound of Silas's heavy boots on the hard-packed earth outside. Fear, her old and constant companion, stirred in her gut. She had been given a room, a bed, a moment of rest. Now, the morning had come, and with it, the expectation of payment. She slid out of bed, her bare feet meeting the cold, smooth planks of the floor. The simple dress she had worn during her escape was a dusty, tattered ruin. She smoothed it down as best she could, her hands trembling slightly, and prepared herself for whatever came next. When she stepped into the main room, the scene that greeted her was one of quiet, domestic industry. Raoul was hunched over the hearth, coaxing a proper fire from the glowing coals. The coffee pot was already nestled in the stones, its rich, dark aroma beginning to fill the air. The little boy, Tom, was sitting at the table, meticulously arranging a small collection of smooth river stones into a line. He looked up at her, his dark eyes wide and curious, before quickly looking down again at his stones, a flush of shyness on his cheeks. Silas was nowhere to be seen. Eleanor stood awkwardly in the doorway of her room, feeling like a ghost, an intruder in this self-contained world. She waited for a command, an order, a look that would tell her what was required of her. None came. Raoul glanced at her, gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod that was neither friendly nor unfriendly, and then turned his full attention back to the fire. Tom continued his silent game. The lack of expectation was more unnerving than any demand. She was adrift, without a role, in her life. Purpose had always been dictated by others, usually in the form of a chore to be done under threat of punishment. Here, there was only a quiet, peaceful vacuum, unsure of what else to do. She retreated to her room. If she could not be useful, she could at least be invisible. But the four walls of the small room felt like a cage. She couldn't just sit and wait. Her hands, so used to being busy, felt twitchy and useless. Driven by an instinct she barely understood, she began to clean. She started with the wash basin, scrubbing it until the ceramic gleamed. She tidied the quilt on her bed, pulling it taut and smoothing every wrinkle until it was perfectly flat. Finding a worn cloth in the washstand, she began to dust the old wardrobe, her movements small and precise. The work was a comfort, a familiar ritual in a world that had become utterly strange. It was a way to impose order on a tiny corner of the chaos that had been her life. When her own room was as clean as she could make it, she ventured back out. Raoul was now sitting at the table, sipping coffee and watching Tom. Silas had returned and was also at the table, his back to her, cleaning his pistol with a concentration that was absolute. The sight of the gun sent a familiar chill through her, but the way he handled it was different. It was the tool of a professional, not the weapon of a bully. His movements were efficient, respectful of the machine in his hands, ignoring the knot of fear in her stomach. Eleanor found the cabin's broom a bundle of stiff bristles tied to a smooth wooden handle and began to sweep the floor. She moved quietly, carefully, trying to be as unobtrusive as possible. The soft shush-shush of the broom was the only sound she made. She swept around the table, under the chairs, her head bowed, her focus entirely on the task. She felt their eyes on her, Raoul's sharp, assessing gaze and Tom's childish curiosity. Silas did not turn around, but she felt the stillness of his attention, a weight in the air behind her. No one told her to stop. No one told her she was doing it wrong. When she was finished, she gathered the dust in a small pan and threw it into the fire, where it disappeared with a brief, bright flare. Then she took the tin plates from their breakfast and carried them to a large basin near the door. She found the lye soap and began to wash them, her hands dipping into the cool water. This was a language she knew, the language of work, of service. It was her only way of saying thank you, of trying to balance the scales of a debt she felt she could never repay. Later that morning, she followed Silas outside, keeping a respectful distance. He walked to the small, sun-drenched field behind the corral, a place where the wild grasses grew thick and tall. He carried a long, gracefully curved scythe, its blade honed to a razor's edge. He began to work, his body moving with a powerful, hypnotic rhythm. The scythe swung in a wide, shimmering arc, the blade whispering through the grass, which fell in neat, fragrant rows. It was hard, relentless work, yet he moved with an easy grace that spoke of long practice. Eleanor watched from the shade of a lone cottonwood tree, feeling useless again. This was man's work, a world of muscle and steel she could not enter. But she couldn't just stand there. She went back to the cabin, filled a tin cup with cool water from the well, and carried it out to him. She approached him cautiously, as one might approach a wild animal, and held it out. He stopped his work, the scythe coming to rest at his side. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling. Sweat trickled from his temples, carving clean paths through the dust on his skin. He looked at the cup, then at her. He took it without a word, his large, calloused fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her. He drank the water down in one go, then handed the cup back, his gratitude expressed in a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a beginning, a tiny crack in the wall of silence between them. Emboldened, Eleanor found an old, long-handled rake leaning against the stable wall and began to gather the cut grass, pulling it into small, neat piles. The work was surprisingly difficult. The sun was hot on her back, and soon her own clothes were damp with sweat. Her muscles, unused to such labor, began to ache, but there was a satisfaction in it, in the simple, honest toil. They worked for hours in a shared silence, the only sounds the whisper of his scythe and the soft scratch of her rake. During a break in the afternoon, Silas sat on a large, flat rock at the edge of the field. Eleanor saw him wince slightly as he settled his weight. She noticed a sharp, jutting edge on the stone. Without thinking, she untied the simple cloth apron she had found in the cabin and folded it into a thick square. She walked over to him, her heart thumping with a strange nervousness. He watched her approach, his gray eyes questioning. She didn't speak. She simply knelt and placed the folded cloth on the rock beside his leg. He stared at the small, padded square for a long moment. It was such a small gesture, a thing of almost no consequence. Yet, in the silent world they inhabited, it was a shout. It was an act of care, of observation, of thinking of his comfort before her own. He slowly, deliberately, shifted his weight, moving to sit on the cloth she had provided. He did not thank her, but as he looked up at her, the stony hardness in his eyes seemed to fractionally lessen, like a stone surface warming in the sun. Her relationship with the boy, Tom, was a slower, more delicate dance. He would watch her from a distance as she did her chores, his thumb often in his mouth. One afternoon, as she sat on the cabin step, mending a tear in one of Tom's shirts, he approached her. He walked with the careful, hesitant steps of a small child in the presence of a stranger. He stopped a few feet away and held out his hand. In his small, grubby palm lay a perfect, spiral-shaped snail shell. Eleanor looked at the shell, then at his serious, expectant face. She slowly reached out and took it, her fingers tracing its delicate shape. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. The boy's face broke into a radiant smile. It was a moment of pure, unguarded connection. From then on, he was her shadow, bringing her his treasures, a bird's feather, a strangely shaped twig, a handful of dandelions. She, in turn, found herself speaking to him in a soft voice she didn't know she possessed, telling him simple stories as she worked. Silas would often watch them from a distance, his face unreadable, but he no longer seemed like such a formidable stranger when seen through the lens of his quiet, paternal care for the boy. One evening, a few days after her arrival, Eleanor was down by the creek, washing the supper dishes. The setting sun had turned the water to liquid gold. Tucked in a crevice between two large, moss-covered rocks, a single, stubborn blue wildflower was growing, its vibrant color a small miracle against the gray stone. On impulse, she picked it. She carried it back to the cabin, her hand cupped around its delicate petals. She filled one of the tin cups with water and placed the flower inside, setting it in the middle of the rough-hewn dinner table. It was a ridiculously small, feminine touch in this spare, masculine world. It changed nothing, and yet it changed everything. It was an assertion of her presence, a splash of color and life that she had brought into the cabin. When Silas and Raoul came in for supper, both men noticed it. Raoul raised a white eyebrow but said nothing. Silas stopped and looked at the flower for a long moment. He didn't comment, but he moved the cup to the side with unusual care before sitting down. The next afternoon, the breakthrough happened. Tom was trying to catch a large yellow butterfly that was flitting around the yard. He ran in clumsy, joyous circles, his laughter pealing through the quiet valley. Eleanor was hanging laundry on a line stretched between two trees, and she stopped to watch him, a clothespin in her hand, the sight of his pure, unadulterated happiness, the safety of the sun-drenched valley, the growing sense of peace in her own heart. It all coalesced into a single, unfamiliar feeling. A smile touched her lips. It was not the tight, forced grimace of her past, a mask used to placate and survive. It was a real smile, a gentle, unconscious curve of her mouth that reached all the way to her eyes. Across the yard, Silas was mending a section of the corral fence. He had been hammering a new rail into place, but the sound of Tom's laughter had made him pause. He turned, and he saw her. He saw the smile. He went completely still, the hammer held loosely in his hand. He watched her for a long, silent moment, his own expression unreadable. But it was in his eyes that the true change was visible, the ever-present caution, the hard, watchful quality that made them seem like chips of slate, softened. The gray seemed to warm, to lighten, the way a cloudy sky does when the sun is about to break through. He said nothing. He didn't need to. In that silent, shared moment across the dusty yard, a new language was born between them, one made not of words, but of wildflowers, folded aprons, and a single, unexpected smile. The silence of the valley was no longer something to be feared. It had become a comfort, a space filled not with emptiness, but with a quiet, burgeoning understanding. The days settled into a rhythm, as gentle and predictable as the rise and fall of the sun over the valley walls. The sharp edges of Eleanor's fear began to dull, worn smooth by the quiet routine of the cabin. She had a place. She had a purpose, woven from 100 small, necessary tasks: feeding the chickens, weeding the small garden, stirring the stew, mending Tom's perpetually torn trousers. The silence that had once been a void of uncertainty was now a comfortable, living thing, filled with the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind, and the quiet sounds of shared work. It was in this newfound peace that the past began to stir, like silt at the bottom of a still pond. Her memories were no longer churned by the constant current of fear, and they began to rise to the surface. She found herself watching Tom play and feeling a hollow ache for the childhood she had never been allowed. She watched the quiet, respectful way Silas treated Raoul and felt the sting of a father's love she had never known. The safety of the present made the horrors of the past feel both more distant and more sharply defined. One evening, after a particularly peaceful day, the dam finally broke. Supper was over. Tom was sound asleep in his cot, his small face peaceful in the firelight. Raoul, after his customary pipe, had grunted a good night and retired to his own small bunk behind a curtain. The cabin was quiet, save for the low hiss of the fire and the clink of tin plates as Eleanor cleared the table. She carried the dishes to the large wash basin, the familiar chore, a comforting anchor. As she poured hot water from the kettle, the steam rising to mist her face, Silas came to stand beside her. He didn't speak, but picked up a clean, dry cloth from a hook on the wall. It had become their evening ritual, an unspoken partnership. She would wash, and he would dry. They worked in their usual comfortable silence for several minutes. their movements synchronized and efficient. But tonight, the silence felt different to Eleanor. It felt heavy, filled with the things she had never said. She washed a plate, her hands moving automatically. But her mind was miles away, trapped in a dusty, whiskey-soaked past. She spoke without meaning to. The words simply came out, a quiet, ragged whisper that was nearly swallowed by the sound of splashing water. He used to say my hands were my only asset. Silas paused, a half-dried plate in his hand. He didn't turn his head, didn't ask who he was. He simply waited, his stillness a silent invitation for her to continue. My father, she clarified, her voice still quiet and flat. He said they were quick and clever enough to earn my keep, one way or another. She scrubbed at a stubborn spot on a pan, her knuckles white. Usually, it was by mending the clothes of the men he lost to at cards, or serving them drinks while they laughed about how he'd gambled away his last dollar. She told the story in fragments, her gaze fixed on the murky water in the basin. She spoke of a life lived on a knife's edge of uncertainty, of her father's brief, feverish highs when he had a pocketful of money, and the long, terrifying lows when he had nothing but debts and a sour temper. She spoke of the smell of stale liquor, a smell that could still make her stomach clench, and the sound of men's loud, cruel laughter seeping through the thin walls of whatever ramshackle room they were living in. He was always chasing a dream, she said, a bitter irony in her tone. A big score that would fix everything. He'd get a little money, and for a day or two, he'd be a father. He'd buy me a ribbon for my hair, but then he'd hear about a card game or a horse race, and the dream would get thirsty. It always did. Silas continued to dry the dishes. The steady, rhythmic sweep of his cloth against the tin was a grounding counterpoint to the chaotic story tumbling from her lips. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't make a single sound of pity. He just listened, his presence a solid, unmovable wall she could lean her words against. The last dream he had. It was the biggest one. Her hands stilled in the water. He found a man with deep pockets, a man who owned a freighting company. Jedediah. She said the name and a visible shudder went through her. My father saw him as a partner, an investor, but Jedediah didn't invest in dreams. He invested in property. She took a shaky breath, the memory thick and suffocating in her throat. My father ran out of money to bet. He had nothing left, nothing but me. The words were out now, the ugly, shameful truth laid bare in the warm, quiet cabin. She wasn't a person to her father. She was a marker, a final, desperate wager. Jedediah had won the pot, and she was the prize. It wasn't a marriage, she whispered, the words trembling with a hatred and fear she had suppressed for so long. It was a contract, a bill of sale. He was coming to collect me at the stagecoach stop. That's why I was there. That's what I was running from. Her voice finally cracked on the last word. A dry, ragged sob caught in her throat, and she couldn't speak anymore. Her shoulders began to shake, her head bowed low over the basin, hot tears mingling with the dishwater. She felt utterly exposed, her shame a raw, open wound. She braced herself for his reaction, for disgust, for pity, or worse, for the cold judgment that would tell her she was sullied goods. Silas stopped drying. The rhythmic sound ceased. The silence that fell was absolute. She kept her head down, unable to look at him, her hands clenched into fists in the greasy water. Then she sensed movement, not away from her, but toward her. A clean, dry cloth entered her field of vision. Silas was standing beside her, holding out the towel he had been using. He wasn't looking at her face, but at her trembling hands. His own hand was steady, his offering simple and direct. She slowly, hesitantly, reached out and took the cloth. It was warm and dry. She clutched it, the rough texture a grounding reality in her swirling sea of memory. She brought it to her eyes, wiping away the tears that streamed down her cheeks. When she finally found the courage to look up at him, his gray eyes were fixed on her, and in them, she saw none of the things she had feared. There was no judgment. There was no pity. There was only a deep, profound, and unwavering understanding. His gaze held hers, and in its quiet depths, she saw a reflection of her own pain. It was the look of a man who was no stranger to loss, who knew the anatomy of a wound. He had his own stories, his own scars, and in that moment, he recognized hers as clearly as if they were his own. He didn't need to say, "I understand." He didn't need to say, "You're safe now." His eyes said it all. His silent presence, his simple offering of a cloth, spoke a language far more powerful and healing than words could ever express. He was not just a rescuer. He was a witness. He had listened to the ugliest chapter of her life and had not turned away. She gave a final, shuddering sigh and turned back to the basin. She pulled the plug, letting the dirty water drain away. It felt symbolic, as if some of the poison from her past was draining away with it. Silas picked up the last wet plate from the rack and began to dry it, the familiar, rhythmic sound resuming, stitching the torn fabric of the evening back together. They finished their task in a silence that was deeper and more intimate than any they had shared before. A wall had come down, not with a crash, but with a quiet, mutual consent. When the last dish was put away, Eleanor turned to him, the damp cloth still clutched in her hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was for everything, for the rescue, for the shelter, for the silence, and most of all, for listening. Silas merely nodded, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer. He then turned and banked the fire for the night, his movements as economical and deliberate as ever. But as he moved, Eleanor saw that the tension he always held in his shoulders was slightly eased. The weight of her story had not been a burden to him. It had been a bridge. That night, as she lay in her small, quiet room, Eleanor felt a profound shift within her. The story that had haunted her, that had defined her as a victim, had lost some of its power. By speaking it aloud, by having it received with such quiet, powerful grace, she had taken a piece of it back. She was no longer just the girl who was running away. She was a woman who had survived, and in the silent, watchful heart of this hidden valley, she was finally, miraculously, beginning to heal. The peace of the valley had become a quiet, steady rhythm in Eleanor's blood. The weeks that followed her confession unfolded in a sequence of sun-drenched, tranquil days. The fear that had been her shadow for years had receded, becoming a faint, distant memory, like a story that had happened to someone else. She learned the language of this place, the way the light changed on the canyon walls to mark the hours. The specific creak of the porch swing that meant Raoul was thinking, the soft, happy hum Tom made when he was engrossed in one of his small, imaginary games. She had found her footing in this silent, self-contained world. Her hands, which she once saw only as tools for survival, became instruments of care. They learned the heft of a full water bucket, the feel of dough rising, the precise way to stitch a patch so it would hold. She was no longer an intruder, a guest holding her breath. She was a part of the rhythm, a note in the quiet song of the valley. The night it happened began like any other. A cool breeze whispered down from the high mesas, carrying the scent of pine and dust. Supper was a simple affair of rabbit stew and fresh-baked bread, eaten in the warm, flickering glow of the fire. Tom, his eyelids heavy, had fallen asleep with his head in Eleanor's lap as she told him a rambling story about a brave little chipmunk. Silas had carried him to his cot, his movements gentle and sure. Raoul sat in his rocking chair, his eyes closed, though Eleanor knew he was not asleep but simply listening to the night. Silas was cleaning a rifle at the table, the soft, metallic click and slide of the mechanism a familiar, almost comforting sound. Eleanor was gathering the last of the mending. her needle weaving in and out of a tear in Silas's shirt. A feeling of profound contentment settled over her. So warm and real it was almost a physical presence in the room. This was home. This was safety. The first warning was so subtle it was almost missed. Silas's horse, tethered in the lean-to, gave a sudden, sharp snort of alarm. Silas froze, his hands still on the rifle. Every line of his body went rigid. He lifted his head, his gray eyes fixed on the dark, empty space of the open doorway, listening. The wind sighed. A cricket chirped. Then, nothing. "Probably just a coyote," Raoul said, his voice a low rasp, his eyes still closed, but he had stopped rocking. Silas didn't answer. He slowly, silently, began to reassemble the rifle. Eleanor's heart began a low, nervous thumping against her ribs. The peaceful contentment of moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling dread. The silence from outside was no longer peaceful. It was watchful, predatory. Then came the second sound, a soft, scraping noise, just outside the cabin wall, the sound of a boot scuffing against stone. In a single, fluid movement, Silas was on his feet, the rifle in his hands. His eyes met Eleanor's across the room, and in them, she saw a look that turned her blood to ice. It was the same flat, hard look he had worn in the saloon, the look of a man facing a known and deadly threat. "Raoul," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Get the boy." Before Raoul could even push himself out of his chair, the world exploded. The cabin door, which had been standing slightly ajar to catch the evening breeze, burst inward with a splintering crash. It was not kicked, it was shouldered, the wood groaning in protest as three dark figures spilled into the room, bringing the cold, hostile night in with them. At their head was Jedediah. His arm was in a sling, his face a twisted mask of fury and triumph. Behind him were two others, their faces hard and shadowed in the firelight, the nervous, wiry Clem and a burly, bearded man she didn't recognize. "Evening," Jedediah sneered, his voice thick with malice. "Sorry to drop in unannounced. We were just in the neighborhood, tracking a piece of property that got away from me." His eyes locked on Eleanor, and a possessive, ugly grin spread across his face. Silas didn't waste time on words. He brought the rifle up, but before he could aim, the burly man lunged at him from the side. The two men crashed into the table, sending plates and cups scattering across the floor with a deafening clatter. Silas was strong, a man of corded muscle and raw power, but he was caught off guard and outnumbered. He brought the butt of the rifle up, catching the burly man under the chin with a sickening crack. The man staggered back, but Clem was already moving, a long, wicked-looking knife in his hand, jabbing toward Silas's side. It was a scene of pure, violent chaos. Grunts of effort, the thud of fists on flesh, the crash of furniture. Raoul, moving with a surprising speed for his age, had reached Tom's cot and was trying to shield the terrified, now awake boy with his own frail body. Eleanor was frozen, a scream trapped in her throat. Her mind couldn't process the sudden, brutal violation of her sanctuary. She saw Silas fighting with a cold, desperate efficiency, using the rifle as a club, keeping the two men at bay. He was a force of nature, a cornered wolf fighting for his den. For a moment, it seemed he might actually win. He shoved the burly man into the wall with enough force to shake the whole cabin, then spun to meet Clem's next rush. But he never saw Jedediah. While Silas was occupied, Jedediah had moved around the edge of the fight. With his good arm, he unholstered his pistol. He didn't fire. He stepped up behind Silas and brought the heavy barrel of the gun down in a vicious, sweeping arc against the side of Silas's head. The sound was a dull, wet thud that cut through all the other noise. Silas's body went limp. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor like a felled tree, the rifle clattering from his nerveless grasp. He lay utterly still in a heap by the hearth, a dark trickle of blood already beginning to snake its way from his hair onto the stone. The fight was over. The sudden silence that fell was more terrifying than the noise had been. "Now," Jedediah said, breathing heavily, his grin returning. "As I was saying." He took a step towards Eleanor, his eyes burning with a triumphant, cruel light. Her world had narrowed to a single point of terror. Silas was down. He wasn't moving. The man she had been running from her entire life was here, in her home, and there was no one left to protect her. But then a new sound pierced her fear-frozen consciousness, a small, terrified whimper. Tom. While Jedediah's attention was on her, the wiry man, Clem, had seen his opportunity. He darted over to the corner where Raoul was huddled over the cot. He shoved the old man aside with a callous shove that sent Raoul sprawling. Before anyone could react, Clem snatched Tom from the bed. He wrapped one thin, strong arm around the boy's chest, pinning his arms to his sides. In his other hand, the knife appeared, its blade glinting in the firelight as he pressed the flat of it against the side of Tom's small, trembling neck. "Nobody move!" Clem shrieked, his voice high and thin with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "I mean it!" Tom let out a strangled cry of terror, his small body rigid with shock, his wide, dark eyes fixed on Eleanor. Everything inside her shattered. The fear, the panic, the lifetime of learned helplessness, it all burned away in a sudden, volcanic eruption of pure, protective rage. It was an emotion so fierce, so absolute. It was incandescent. They had hurt Silas. They had invaded her home, and now they had their hands on her boy. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer afraid. She was a mother bear whose cub was threatened. And in that instant, she was the most dangerous thing in the room. Her eyes darted around, looking for a weapon. Her gaze fell on the rifle Silas had dropped. It lay on the floor just a few feet from where he lay unconscious. Jedediah saw where she was looking. He laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Don't even think about it, girl. You ain't got the stomach for it." He was wrong. She moved. She didn't run. She dove, scrambling across the floor on her hands and knees, ignoring the splinters that dug into her palms. Her hand closed around the cool, smooth wood of the rifle stock. It was heavy, heavier than she could have imagined, an awkward, alien weight in her hands. She pushed herself to her feet, her movements clumsy but driven by a ferocious, desperate purpose. She fumbled with the rifle, trying to hold it the way she had seen Silas hold it. Her hands were trembling violently, not from fear, but from the sheer force of the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of war. She raised the rifle. The long, heavy barrel wavered, a V of iron sights swimming before her eyes. She tried to aim at Clem, but he was moving, keeping Tom's small body between them as a shield. "I told you!" Clem screeched, pressing the knife a little closer. Tom let out another terrified sob. Rage and helplessness warred within her. She couldn't get a clear shot. Jedediah took another step towards her, confident, savoring her desperation. "It's over," he said, reaching for her. And in that moment, her focus shifted. Clem was just a symptom. Jedediah was the disease. He was the source of all of this, the architect of her pain, the monster who had haunted her life. With a surge of cold, clear certainty, she swung the heavy barrel of the rifle away from Clem and leveled it squarely at Jedediah's chest. Her entire world narrowed to the space between the end of the barrel and the sneering face of the man who had bought her. The shaking in her hand stopped. A cold, preternatural calm descended over her. She saw his eyes widen in surprise, a flicker of disbelief crossing his features. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow, a deafening concussive roar that shook the very logs of the cabin. The rifle kicked back against her shoulder with the force of a mule, sending a jarring shock through her entire body and throwing her back a step. The smell of burnt gunpowder filled the air, acrid and sharp. Jedediah staggered back, a look of pure, dumbfounded shock on his face. A dark, blossoming stain appeared high on his left shoulder, near his collarbone. He looked down at it, then back at her, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. He dropped his own pistol with a clatter and collapsed to his knees, clutching his shoulder with his good hand. The shot had broken the spell. For a heartbeat, everyone was frozen in stunned silence. Then, from the dark doorway of the small back room, another sound echoed through the cabin, the loud, definitive double click of a shotgun being cocked. Raoul stood there, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. He was no longer a frail old man. He was an ancient, avenging angel, and in his hands he held a massive, double-barreled shotgun, its twin muzzles looking like two dark, gaping tunnels into the grave. He leveled the gun at Clem. "Let the boy go!" Raoul rasped, his voice as cold and final as a winter wind. "Now." Clem stared at the wounded, kneeling Jedediah, at the wild-eyed woman holding the rifle, and then into the twin black holes of the shotgun. The knife clattered from his nerveless fingers. He shoved Tom away from him, the boy stumbling and falling to the floor. "We're going," the third man, the burly one, gasped, his bravado completely gone. He grabbed Jedediah, hauling his groaning boss to his feet. Together, they half-dragged, half-carried him out the door, Clem scrambling after them like a terrified rat. They were gone. The sudden, ringing silence was a physical thing. It pressed in on Eleanor's ears. The only sounds were Tom's hiccuping sobs and the ragged sound of her own breathing. The rifle slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. The strength that had surged through her vanished, leaving her weak and trembling, her body shaking with the aftershocks of what she had done. Tom scrambled across the floor and threw his arms around her legs, burying his face in her dusty dress, his small body shaking. She sank to her knees and held him, her own tears finally beginning to fall, hot and silent. The air was thick with the smell of blood and panic. The sanctuary had been violated, but it had held. They had held. Then she remembered. She pulled away from Tom and crawled across the floor to where Silas lay, so still and silent by the fire. "Silas?" she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his face. His skin was warm, but he didn't stir. His blood was dark and sticky on the stone floor, and on her fingers. The night was far from over. The chaos receded, leaving a ringing silence in its wake, thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield. For a stunned moment, Eleanor could only kneel on the floor, clutching a sobbing Tom, her mind a maelstrom of shock and horror. The heavy weight of the rifle she had fired felt like a brand on her soul. Then Raoul's voice, sharp and steady, cut through her daze. "Ellie, the boy is safe. See to Silas." The words were a bucket of cold water, snapping her back to a reality that was, in its own way, more terrifying than the attack itself. Silas. He was still on the floor, a dark, motionless heap by the hearth. The world narrowed to his still form. She scrambled over to him, her hands clumsy with dread. "We must get him to his bed," Raoul said, his movements already purposeful as he lit another lamp, banishing the darkest of the shadows. "Check his wound." His wound, the dark, matted patch in his hair where Jedediah's pistol had struck. Her breath hitched. With a trembling finger, she gently parted the hair. The cut was deep and bleeding sluggishly, but as Raoul brought the lamp closer, they could see that the bone beneath, thank God, was not broken. A hard knock, Raoul assessed, his voice grim. "He will be in the dark for a while. We need to get him lying flat." Moving him was a feat of desperate strength. He was a heavy, dead weight, his powerful body completely limp. Between them, she and Raoul managed to half lift, half drag him to his simple wooden bed in the corner of the main room. As they laid him down, his head lolled to the side with a terrifying lack of resistance. His face, usually so composed and strong, was slack and pale beneath his sun-bronzed skin. He looked like a fallen giant. And so the vigil began. The hours that followed bled into a timeless, focused sequence of tasks. Raoul, after barring the shattered door and ensuring Tom was settled back to sleep, took charge of the cabin's defense, his shotgun now leaning in the corner where he could always see it. Eleanor's world, however, shrank to the small, fraught space around Silas's bed. Her first act was one of profound, tender reverence. She filled a basin with warm water and, with a clean cloth, began to clean the blood from his hair and face. Her touch was infinitely gentle, as if she were handling the most fragile piece of porcelain. She cleaned the cut with a stinging antiseptic Raoul provided, her own hands steady now, fueled by a purpose so clear and absolute it left no room for fear. She was paying a debt. She was holding on to the man who had become her anchor in the world. The first night was the longest of her life. She sat in a wooden chair pulled up to his bedside, watching the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest. Every breath he took was a victory. Every moment he remained lost in the silent darkness was a torment. The fire in the hearth burned down to embers. The moon arced across the sky, and still she sat, a solitary sentinel. Tom cried out in his sleep, and she went to him, murmuring soft words of comfort until his breathing evened out again, before returning immediately to her post. She would not leave Silas alone, not for a minute. The days that followed took on a new, solemn rhythm. The sun would rise, and Raoul would move about his chores with a grim quiet, his presence a steady, unobtrusive support. He would bring her a cup of hot, black coffee in the morning and a plate of food in the evening, which she would often forget to eat. Her own needs for sleep, for food, for rest had become secondary, insignificant. Her entire being was focused on the still figure in the bed. Tom, with the resilient innocence of a child, seemed to understand. He did not ask to play loud games. Instead, he would bring a piece of charcoal and a smooth plank of wood and sit on the floor near the bed, quietly drawing. He drew pictures of horses, of the cabin, of a tall man with a hat. His quiet, focused presence was a comfort to Eleanor, a small, living flame of the life that Silas had fought to protect, a life she now fiercely guarded. When Silas's breathing grew stronger, but he still did not wake, Raoul showed her how to make a thin, nourishing broth. Feeding him was an act of excruciating patience and intimacy. She would sit on the edge of the bed, carefully cradling his head in the crook of her arm. She would dip the spoon into the warm liquid and touch it to his lips, murmuring to him, coaxing him, just a little. "Silas, you need your strength." Sometimes a little of the broth would trickle past his lips, and she would count it as a monumental triumph. She was tethering him to the world, one spoonful at a time. She talked to him constantly. At first, it was just whispers, updates on the quiet life of the cabin. "The sun is bright today. Silas, Tom found a frog down by the creek." But as the days stretched into a week with no change, a new kind of desperation took hold. She looked at the small, worn collection of books on the shelf, the books he had taught Tom to read from. She took one down. It was a simple book of fables, its cover soft with use. She pulled her chair closer, took his limp hand in hers, and began to read. Her voice was low and unsteady at first, but it grew stronger, more confident as she went on. She read about clever foxes and foolish crows, about brave mice and slumbering lions. The stories were for Tom, who listened intently from his spot on the floor, but the words were for Silas. She poured all of her hope, all of her will, all of her burgeoning, unspoken love into the cadence of her voice. She read not just to fill the silence, but to forge a weapon against it. She imagined her voice as a thread, a string of light cast into the deep, silent ocean where he was drifting. She hoped that if she spoke long enough, and with enough conviction, he might hear it, that he might grab hold of that thread and follow it, pull himself along it, hand over hand, back into the world of light and sound, back to her. Days blurred. She lost track of time. Her world was measured in spoonfuls of broth, in pages turned, in the changing light on his still face. She grew thin, with dark circles under her eyes, but she did not falter. The woman who had spent her life running had finally found a place worth standing her ground. She was no longer a victim of circumstances. She was a warrior, and her battlefield was this quiet, lamplit corner of a cabin. Her enemy, the crushing silence that held this good man in its grip. It happened on an afternoon that was no different from any other. A soft rain was falling outside, a gentle drumming on the roof. Tom was napping. Raoul was outside in the lean-to, mending a harness. Eleanor was reading, her voice growing hoarse, her head starting to nod with exhaustion. She had just finished a story and had let the book fall into her lap. Her eyes closed for just a moment. The silence in the room felt heavy, empty. She opened her eyes, a familiar wave of despair washing over her, and found him looking at her. He was awake. His eyes, no longer blank and unfocused, were open. They were clouded with pain and a deep, weary confusion, but they were his eyes, and they were fixed on her face. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. She didn't move, didn't speak, afraid that the slightest sound would break the spell and send him away again. He blinked slowly, like a man waking from a sleep of 100 years. His gaze moved from her face, around the familiar room, and then back to her. His lips moved, dry and cracked, a sound, little more than a rough exhalation of air, escaped. "Why, daughter." The spell was broken. A choked sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her. She was on her feet in an instant, her exhaustion forgotten. "Silas," she breathed, her voice trembling. She fumbled with the cup and pitcher, her hands shaking so badly she could barely pour. She helped him drink, cradling his head just as she had done 1,000 times. But this time was different. This time, he was helping. This time, he was present. He drank thirstily, then sank back against the pillows, his eyes closing for a moment. She sat back down on the edge of the bed, her heart hammering. Tears she hadn't realized she was crying now streaming down her face. He didn't say much more. He was too weak, drifting in and out of a true, healing sleep. But later that evening, as she sat in her customary chair, simply watching him breathe, he stirred again. She leaned forward, thinking he needed something. He opened his eyes, and this time, the confusion was gone, replaced by a quiet clarity. He looked at her tired face, at the mending basket in her lap, at the book of fables on the small table beside her. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the very first time. Then, with a slow, deliberate effort that seemed to take all the strength he possessed, he lifted his hand from the quilt. It was the hand of a man who worked, scarred and calloused, but it trembled with weakness. He reached across the small space between them. She understood. She put her own hand in his. His fingers, surprisingly warm, closed around hers. His grip was not strong, but it was firm. It was a connection. It was an acknowledgement. It was everything. He held her hand, his thumb stroking softly over her knuckles, his gray eyes holding hers, and in that simple, silent gesture, the entire world shifted. All the lonely nights, all the desperate days, all the whispered hopes and fears, coalesced into this single, profound moment. In his touch, she felt not just gratitude, but a deep and resonant understanding. It was a silent promise, a mutual claim. He was telling her that he had heard her, that he had followed the thread of her voice back from the darkness. A single, final tear traced a path down her cheek, but this one was not for sorrow or fear. It was for the beautiful, aching, overwhelming certainty that flooded her heart as Silas's hand held hers, solid and real in the quiet of the lamplit cabin. Eleanor knew, with a clarity that shook her to her very soul, that she was no longer alone, and she would never be alone again. Silas's return to the world of the living was a slow, quiet dawn. It was not a sudden flood of light, but a gradual, incremental brightening. The deep, unnerving stillness of his unconsciousness was replaced by long stretches of healing sleep. When he was awake, his movements were slow, his voice a low rasp, his strength a pale shadow of what it had been. The wound on his head was healing, but it had left him unsteady on his feet and prone to long periods of silent, brooding exhaustion. This period of convalescence became a new kind of quiet. Eleanor's role shifted from that of a desperate, round-the-clock nurse to something softer, more constant. She was his shadow, his support, his hands when his own were too unsteady. When he first tried to walk, his pride warring with his weakness, it was her arm he leaned on, her smaller, softer frame a surprising well of strength for him to draw from. They would make slow circuits of the cabin, then the porch, and then the yard, his heavy arm draped over her shoulders, her hand resting firmly on his back. They never spoke of the intimacy of these moments, of the profound trust required to place one's entire weight upon another. They didn't have to. The truth of it existed in the careful, measured steps they took together. Love, they discovered, was not a word. It was a language spoken in 1,000 silent, everyday actions. It was the way she would leave a cup of cool water on the porch rail for him, knowing he would be sitting there when the afternoon sun grew warm. It was the way he, watching her struggle to chop firewood with an axe that was too large for her, would get up from his chair, take the tool from her hands without a word, and split a week's worth of wood in a few slow, deliberate swings, though the effort left him pale and trembling. It was in the mending of a shirt. One afternoon, Eleanor sat in the doorway, the warm sun on her back, working on the blue chambray shirt he had worn the night of the attack. It had been washed clean of his blood, but the tear where Clem's knife had nearly found its mark remained. She stitched it with small, neat, even stitches, her needle dipping and rising, weaving the torn fabric back together. The act was a meditation, a quiet prayer of repair. Silas sat on the porch steps, watching her. He watched the intense concentration on her face, the gentle, efficient movement of her fingers. He saw not a chore being done, but a wound being tended to, a piece of his life being made whole again by her hands. When she finished, she folded it neatly and placed it beside him. He simply laid his own large, unscarred hand over the mended cloth, a silent acknowledgement that was more eloquent than any poem. Their lives, once so separate and solitary, had braided themselves together so tightly they were no longer distinguishable. He was a man of the earth, of seasons and signs. He began to teach her, not with words, but by example. He would point to a gathering of clouds in the west, and she would learn to see the coming rain. He would hand her a knife and guide her fingers with his own, showing her the precise angle to hold the whetstone, the exact pressure to apply to give the blade its keenest edge. She, in turn, brought a softness and a sense of order to the raw, masculine edges of his world. The cabin, once merely a shelter, now held the scent of baking bread and drying herbs. Small touches of beauty appeared, a row of smooth, white stones lining the walkway, a curtain that was not just functional but clean and bright. They watched each other from a distance. He would be in the corral, his strength slowly returning as he worked with his horse, and he would look up to see her standing in the garden, a hoe in her hand, her face turned towards him. She would be hanging laundry on the line, the white sheets billowing in the breeze, and she would feel his gaze on her from the porch, a quiet, steady regard that was as warm and constant as the sun. These looks were not filled with the heat of a new and feverish passion. They were deeper than that. They were looks of profound recognition, a quiet confirmation that the other was there, a fixed and essential point in their shared universe. Tom and Raoul were the silent chorus to this unspoken opera. Raoul would watch them from his rocking chair, a rare, small smile touching his wrinkled lips, his dark eyes knowing and content. Tom, now completely devoted to Eleanor, would divide his time between them, a small, happy shuttle weaving back and forth, carrying messages of dandelions and interesting bugs, solidifying their unit, making them undeniably, irrevocably, a family. One afternoon, the world felt particularly perfect. A recent rain had washed the air clean, and the valley was a vibrant tapestry of greens and reds, the sky a high, flawless blue. Silas was strong enough now to work for hours at a time, and he was down in the field. The steady, rhythmic swing of his scythe a reassuring heartbeat in the quiet of the valley. Eleanor, feeling a lightness in her spirit that she had never known before, walked along the creek bed. There, growing in the exact same crevice of rock where she had seen one before, was a single, perfect wildflower, its petals a shade of blue so deep and pure it seemed to have captured a piece of the sky. It was a symbol of resilience, of beauty, thriving in the hardest of places. It was her story. It was theirs. She picked it carefully, its slender stem cool between her fingers. She carried it back to the cabin, but she didn't put it in a cup of water on the table as she had done before. That was a gesture for a guest, a visitor. This felt different. This was an offering, with a shyness that felt strange and new. She walked onto the porch where Silas often sat after his work was done. She laid the single, perfect flower on the worn, sun-bleached wood of the porch railing, right next to the spot where his hand usually rested. She didn't wait to see if he would notice. She simply left it there, a silent, hopeful message, and went back inside. That evening, the rhythm of their life played out as it always did. They ate their supper, the conversation a comfortable mix of Raoul's dry observations and Tom's excited chatter. Afterward, Raoul took Tom outside to look at the stars, leaving Eleanor and Silas alone in the warm, quiet cabin. She cleared the table, moving back and forth from the wash basin, her back mostly to him. Silas sat at the table, a small, leather-bound ledger and a pencil in his hands. It was the book where he kept the accounts of his small ranch records of feed bought, of livestock sold, of the small, practical details of his life. He worked quietly for a few minutes. Then, Eleanor, turning from the basin with a wet plate in her hand, saw him pause. He reached into his shirt pocket and drew something out. It was the wildflower. He must have picked it up from the railing when he came in. He held it for a moment, his rough thumb gently stroking one of its delicate petals. He then opened the ledger, not to the back where he kept his numbers, but to the middle, to a section of clean, empty pages. He carefully laid the small blue flower flat on the right-hand page. He took a moment to arrange its petals. Then he gently closed the book, his other hand resting on the cover, pressing down. He held it like that for a long time, the simple, silent act of preservation feeling as sacred and binding as any vow spoken before a preacher. He was making her small, fleeting gift a permanent part of his world, pressing it into the very pages that held the story of his life. He must have felt her watching him. He slowly lifted his head, and his eyes met hers across the quiet room. He saw that she had seen him. There was no surprise in his expression, no embarrassment, and she felt no shyness, no uncertainty. In that single, protracted gaze, everything was said. Her offering had been received. It had been understood, and it had been treasured beyond measure. It was a secret they now shared, a silent covenant that bound them more tightly than any chain. He did not smile. She did not speak, but as they looked at each other in the warm, flickering lamplight, a profound and unshakable peace settled between them. They did not need words to name what they had. It was a thing that existed in mended shirts and shared burdens, in watchful glances across a dusty yard. And now, in a single wildflower, pressed and preserved forever in the heart of a good man's book, they had chosen each other, and in the quiet of the valley, Their silent days had already become their forever. The seasons in the valley turned, a slow, silent wheel grinding away the sharp edges of the past. The fierce heat of summer softened into the golden, hazy afternoons of autumn. The cottonwood trees along the creek began to burnish, their leaves turning a brilliant, buttery yellow against the deep blue of the sky. The world was quieting down, gathering itself for the coming winter. And in the small cabin, a similar peace had taken root, deep and unshakable. Silas was whole again. The weakness that had plagued him for weeks had been replaced by his old, easy strength. He moved with the same quiet confidence as before, but something in him had changed. The hard, watchful stillness was still there, but it was no longer a shield against the world. It was the quiet of a man who is at peace in his own skin, in his own home. He laughed more now, a low, rumbling sound that was usually prompted by something Tom said or did, and he watched Eleanor with a look of such profound, steady tenderness it was a physical warmth she could feel across a room. Eleanor, too, was transformed. The hunted look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a clear, calm light. Her hands were no longer just the tools of a servant. They were the hands of a woman who was a master of her own small, essential world. She knew the exact amount of yeast to make the bread rise high and light, the precise moment to pull the stew from the fire, the way to soothe Tom's nightmares with a soft song. She had a home, she had a family, and in the quiet, steady gaze of the man who had given her both, she had found a mirror for the woman she was becoming. They were a unit, a self-contained constellation of 4 souls moving in a comfortable, established orbit. The days were filled with the simple, satisfying labor of survival. The nights were filled with a peace so deep and resonant it felt like a prayer. They had built a life, not with grand declarations, but with 1,000 small, interlocking acts of care and trust. Yet, one question remained. A silent, shimmering thing that hung in the air between them, unspoken but ever present. They were a family in every way that mattered, but they were not yet a man and a woman. The moment came on an afternoon dipped in honey. The day's work was done. A hearty meal of roasted quail and baked sweet potatoes had been eaten, and a comfortable, post-supper languor had settled over the cabin. Raoul was teaching Tom how to carve a small wooden bird. The two of them hunched over a piece of soft pine, their heads close together in the fading light. Silas pushed his chair back from the table. "I'm going to check the fence line down by the south pasture," he said, his voice a low rumble, "before the light's gone completely." Eleanor rose, gathering the last of the plates. "I'll come with you," she said. It wasn't a question, and he didn't treat it as one. It was simply a statement of fact. They would go together. They walked out into the golden afternoon. The air was cool and crisp, with the clean, earthy smell of autumn. The sun, low in the western sky, cast long, dramatic shadows that stretched like fingers across the valley floor. They didn't speak as they walked, their boots making soft, rhythmic sounds on the hard-packed earth. Their silence was not empty. It was full. A comfortable vessel that held everything they had come to be to one another. They reached the split-rail fence that marked the edge of the pasture. The wood was old and weathered, worn smooth by years of sun and rain. Its surface the color of old silver. Silas ran his hand along the top rail, testing a loose post, his touch both practical and thoughtful. Eleanor stood beside him, leaning her back against the sturdy wood, her gaze drifting out over the wide, peaceful expanse of the valley. For a long time, they just stood there, 2 quiet figures etched against a landscape of breathtaking, tranquil beauty. The only sounds were the distant call of a quail and the soft, steady murmur of the creek. This was their world, this small, protected pocket of the universe that they had, against all odds, carved out for themselves. Eleanor looked at Silas. The golden light caught in his dark hair and traced the strong, quiet lines of his profile. He was not looking at the fence anymore. He was looking at her, his gray eyes soft in the warm light, and in his gaze, she saw it all, the memory of a dusty saloon, the terror of a desperate flight, the long nights of his recovery, the quiet mornings of their shared life. She saw his respect. She saw his trust. She saw the unspoken, powerful emotion that had become the bedrock of her existence. A feeling of such profound, overwhelming gratitude rose in her chest that it was almost painful. She thought of the frightened, desperate girl she had been, a piece of property to be claimed, her future a dark, terrifying void. And she looked at the woman she was now, strong, capable, safe, loved. The contrast was so stark, so miraculous, it made her feel dizzy. A small, tremulous smile touched her lips, the first truly uncertain expression she had worn in months. She had a home, she had a family, she had a life she had never dared to dream of. But this quiet man beside her, this solid, honorable man who had given her everything, had asked for nothing in return. Their lives were braided together, but the final knot had not been tied. And so she asked the question that held the weight of both their pasts and all of their possible futures. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, a thread of sound nearly lost in the vast, quiet twilight. It trembled with the enormity of the moment, with a lifetime of fear and a universe of hope. "What happens now?" Silas did not answer immediately. He turned his body to face her fully, his presence solid and comforting. He looked deep into her eyes, and in their gray depths, she saw that he had understood the true meaning of her question. He knew she was not asking about tomorrow's chores or the coming winter. She was asking about them, about the silent, powerful thing that had grown between them in the quiet of the valley. She was asking him to finally give it a name. His hands, which had been resting on the fence rail, came up, but he did not reach for her. Instead, with a slow, deliberate grace that was utterly mesmerizing, he lifted his left hand to the front of his shirt. His fingers, calloused and sure, went to the very top button, the one that rested at the hollow of his throat. He undid it. The small, polished bone button slid free from the worn, soft fabric of the placket with a barely audible sound. It was not a gesture of haste or of crude, physical desire. It was an act of profound, symbolic meaning. It was an act of bearing, of revealing. He was unfastening the final piece of armor that shielded his heart. He looked directly into her eyes, his own gaze unwavering, filled with a gravity and a tenderness that made her breath catch. And then he spoke, his voice a low, deep rumble that was as solid and real as the earth beneath their feet. "Anything you want." The words settled over her, not with force, but with the gentle, irresistible weight of truth. It was the most beautiful, most powerful thing anyone had ever said to her. It was not a proposition. It was a promise. It was a transfer of power, an abdication. In a world where she had never been given a single choice, where her life had been dictated by the whims and cruelties of others, this man was giving her everything. He was offering her the deed to his future. He was placing his heart, his home, his very life into her hands and giving her the right to decide its fate. It was the ultimate act of trust, the ultimate declaration of love. They did not kiss, they did not embrace. The moment was too sacred, too fragile for a grand, passionate gesture. Instead, as a single, silent tear of pure, unadulterated joy traced a path down Eleanor's cheek. Silas lifted his right hand and gently, so gently, his fingers brushed against her arm. The touch was feather-light, a whisper of contact, but it sent a shock of profound connection through her entire being. They stood like that for a long, timeless moment, as the last of the golden light faded from the sky and the first stars began to prick the deep, velvet canopy above. They were just two people standing by a fence, their hands barely touching, their shadows merging into one in the gathering dusk. They were two souls who had been forged in the fires of violence and fear, who had found each other in the dust and the desperation. They were two souls who had chosen each other long ago, in 100 silent, everyday ways, and had only just now, in the quiet of a perfect autumn evening, finally admitted it. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to share your city or country and connect with fellow listeners. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach even more people, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.